Clover, Section 2. As Henrietta and Day grew older, they traded Ring Around the Rosie for horse races along the dirt road that ran the length of what used to be the Lax Tobacco Plantation, but was now simply called Laxtown. The boys always fought over who got to ride Charlie Horse, Grandpa Tommy's tall bay, which could outrun any other horse in Clover. Henrietta and the other girls watched from the hillside or the backs of straw-filled wagons, hopping up and down, clapping and screaming as the boys streaked by on horseback. Henrietta often yelled for Day, but sometimes she cheered for another cousin, Crazy Joe Grinnin. Crazy Joe was what their cousin Cliff called an over-average man, tall, husky, and strong, with dark skin, a sharp nose, and so much thick black hair covering his head, arms, back, and neck that he had to shave his whole body in the summer to keep from burning up. They called him Crazy Joe because he was so in love with Henrietta. He'd do anything to get her attention. She was the prettiest girl in Laxtown, with her beautiful smile and walnut eyes. The first time Crazy Joe tried to kill himself over Henrietta, he ran circles around her in the middle of winter while she was on her way home from school. He begged her for a date, saying, "Henny, come on, just give me a chance." And when she laughed and said no, Crazy Joe ran and jumped straight through the ice of a frozen pond and refused to come out until she agreed to go out with him. And all the cousins teased Joe, saying, "Maybe he thought that water might cool him off, but he's so hot for her, that water nearly started boiling." And Henrietta's cousin Sadie, who was Crazy Joe's sister, yelled at him, "Man, you so much in love with the girl, you gonna die for her? That ain't right." No one knew what happened between Henrietta and Crazy Joe, except that there were some dates and some kisses. But Henrietta and Day had been sharing a bedroom since she was 4, so what happened next didn't surprise anyone. They started having children together. Their son Lawrence was born just months after Henrietta's 14th birthday. His sister Lucille Elsie Pleasant came along 4 years later. They were both born on the floor of the home house, like their father, grandmother, and grandfather before them. People wouldn't use words like epilepsy, mental retardation, or neurosyphilis to describe Elsie's condition until years later. To the folks in Laxtown, she was just simple. Touched. She came into the world so fast, Day hadn't even gotten back into with the midwife when Elsie shot right out and hit her head on the floor. Everyone would say maybe that was what left her mind like an infant's. The old dusty record books from Henrietta's church was filled with the names of women cast from the congregation for bearing children out of wedlock. But for some reason, Henrietta never was, even as rumors floated around Laxtown that maybe Crazy Joe had fathered one of her children. And when Crazy Joe found out Henrietta was going to marry Day, he stabbed himself in the chest with the dull pocket knife. His father found him lying drunk in their yard, shirt soaked with blood. He tried to stop the bleeding, but Joe fought him, thrashing and punching, which made him bleed more. Eventually, Joe's father wrestled him to the car, tied him tight to the door, and drove to the doctor. And when Joe got home all bandaged up, Sadie just kept saying, all that to stop Henry from marrying Day. But Crazy Joe wasn't the only one trying to stop the marriage. Henrietta's sister Gladys was always saying Henrietta could do better. When most Laxes talked about Henrietta and Day and their early life in Clover, it sounded as idyllic as a fairy tale. But not Gladys. No one knew why she was so against the marriage, but not Gladys. No one knew. Some folks said Gladys was just jealous because Henrietta was prettier, but Gladys always insisted Day would be a no-good husband. Henrietta and Day married alone at their preacher's house on April 10th, 1941. She was 20, he was 25. They didn't go on a honeymoon because there was too much work to do and no money for travel. By winter, the United States was at war and tobacco companies were supplying free cigarettes to soldiers, so the market was booming. But as large farms flourished, the small ones struggled. Henrietta and Day were lucky if they sold enough tobacco each season to feed the family and plant the next crop. So after their wedding, Day went back to gripping the splintered end of his old wooden plow as Henrietta followed close behind, pulling a homemade wheelbarrow and dropping tobacco steelings into holes in the freshly turned red dirt. Then, one afternoon at the end of 1941, their cousin Fred Garrett came barreling down the dirt road beside their field. He was just back from Baltimore for a visit in his slick 36 Chevy and fancy clothes. Only a year earlier, Fred and his brother Cliff had been tobacco farmers in Clover, too. For extra money, they'd opened a, quote, colored convenience store where most students paid in IOUs. They also ran an old cinder block juke joint where Henrietta often danced on the red dirt floor. Everybody put coins in the jukebox and drank RC Cola, but the profits never amounted to much. So eventually, Fred took his last $3.25 and bought a bus ticket north for a new life. He, like several other cousins, went to work at Bethlehem Steel Sparrows Point Steel Mill and live in Turner Station, a small community of black workers on a peninsula in the Patapsco River, about 20 miles down from downtown Baltimore. In the late 1800s, when Sparrows Point first opened, Turner Station was mostly swamps, farmland, and a few shanties connected with wooden boards for walkways. When demand for steel increased during World War I, streams of white workers moved into the nearby town of Dundalk, and Bethlehem Steel's housing barracks for black workers quickly overflowed, pushing them into Turner Station. By the early years of World War II, Turner Station had a few paved roads, a doctor, a general store, and an iceman. But its residents were still fighting for water, sewage lines, and schools. Then, in December 1941, Japan bombed Pearl Harbor, and it was like Turner Station had won the lottery. The demand for steel skyrocketed, as did for workers. The government poured money into Turner Station, which began filling with 1- and 2-story housing projects, many of them pressed side by side and back to back, some with 400 to 500 units. Most were brick, others covered with asbestos shingles. Some had yards, some didn't. From most of them, you could see the flames dancing above Sparrows Point's furnaces and the eerie red smoke pouring from its smokestacks. Sparrows Point was rapidly becoming the largest steel plant in the world. It produced concrete reinforcing bars, barbed wire, nails, and steel for cars, refrigerator, and military ships. It would burn more than 6 million tons of coal each year to make up to 8 million tons of steel and employ more than 30,000 workers. Bethlehem Steel was a gold mine in a time flush with poverty, especially for black families from the South. Word spread from Maryland to the farms of Virginia and the Carolinas, and as part of what would become known as the Great Migration, black families flocked from the South to Turner Station, the Promised Land. The work was tough, especially for black men, who got the jobs white men wouldn't touch. Like Fred, black workers usually started in the bowels of partially built tankers in the shipyard, collecting bolts, rivets, and nuts as they fell from the hands of men drilling and welding 30 or 40 feet up. Eventually, black workers moved up to the boiler room, where they shoveled coal into blazing furnace. They spent their days breathing in toxic coal dust and asbestos, which they brought home to their wives and daughters, who inhaled it while shaking the men's clothes out for the wash. The black workers at Sparrows Point made about 80 cents an hour at most, usually less. White workers got higher wages, but Fred didn't complain. 80 cents an hour was more than most laxes had ever seen. Fred had made it. Now he'd come back to Clover to convince Henrietta and Day that they should do the same. The morning after he came barreling into town, Fred bought Day a bus ticket to Baltimore. They agreed Henrietta would stay behind to care for the children and the tobacco until Day made enough for a house of their own in Baltimore and 3 tickets north. A few months later, Fred got a draft notice shipping him overseas. And before he left, Fred gave Day all the money he'd saved, saying it was time to get Henrietta and the children to Turner Station. Soon, with a child on each side, Henrietta boarded a coal-fueled train from the small wooden depot at the end of Clover's Main Street. She left the tobacco fields of her youth and the 100-year-old oak tree that shaded her from the sun on so many hot afternoons. And at the age of 21, Henrietta stared through the train window at rolling hills and wide open bodies of water for the first time, heading towards a new life.